Gerald, one thing that we are often asked at MacArthur is why do we fund some things and not others? And particularly in our journalism and media area, but in every one of our areas, truthfully, there are way more good things that we could fund. And frankly, we could give you 10x what we've given you, and I believe you would spend it well 100x, almost infinite, right? That you would put the money to good work. And the difficult thing for us is discerning really between these moral goods. And one of the ways that we put a thumb on the scale, and just to name it, is that some communities have been underrepresented, both in terms of the journalism field, who's telling the stories, and of course underrepresented in terms of having their stories told, right, by the media. And you and I, no doubt, have been in the same conversations, and separate ones too, but where community members have described the harm that they've felt from journalism in the past, either covering or not covering, and naming the racial and wealth inequalities that are embedded in this story. And I think that's one of the things that I feel like you are focused on in a particularly powerful way as an organization, is trying to right those wrongs and to create, going forward, a more equitable, more inclusive, more racially inclusive news and media ecosystem. I may be putting words in your mouth, so please tell me if I'm wrong. But really, I'd be interested in what you see as both the opportunities of doing that and the risks to our society, to our community, to our democracy, if we don't, in fact, include everybody in our communities in the journalism process.
So I'm trying to think of a good corollary. I remember a few years ago, I think it was Citigroup. It was like the third largest bank in the U.S. It did a study showing that the U.S. economy lost like $16 trillion as a result of discrimination against Black folks. Is there a comparison point that is specific to local news and storytelling? I have not seen that study, but I do know that news stories over the last 60 plus years, from the American Society of News Editors, ASNE, I think, RIP, I don't believe that study has been done since 2018, but all the way back to the Criminal Commission report, routinely finds that the professional media workforce is and has been disproportionately white, male, able-bodied, cis, we can go on and on. People who are more wealthy and educated than their coverage areas. And in the case of the ASNE study, newsrooms were increasingly unlikely to share the data needed to do that study survey to assess the problem, and it hasn't continued. So in some ways, we don't even know the full extent of the issue because of the data. But getting back to your question, I'm digressing a bit. I think communities of color actually are quite well positioned to disseminate their stories. Social media and digital production have made that, like, at least logistically simpler. I think traditional newsrooms, for all the reasons that I just mentioned, aren't adequately positioned to disseminate stories of communities of color far and wide. At least not as well positioned as they could be. I think newsrooms have been tragically slow to recognize the value of diversity and belonging within information ecosystems. And so people have had to build systems around newsrooms. I don't think people are just going to not have stories, right? They're not going to not have narratives about their own communities. What they'll do is, in some cases, rightly, distrust the mainstream channels and build new ones. I think that's what we're seeing. So I think journalism suffers when that happens because it becomes more homogenous. It's unable to adapt. And that hits, the bank accounts of newsrooms when entire communities who otherwise might support that work don't, because they don't think that they're represented well. They don't see themselves in that work. They don't think it's their newsroom. And it comes at a cost to our communities too. We know that communities of color are more likely to be preyed on by bad actors that use disinformation campaigns, social media to spread fear and lies. Would that be the case if those communities weren't forced to create alternative channels to be heard? I don't know. I don't think so. I think in a better world, we would see journalists fighting for the public, being public advocates, facilitating the public square, and working with people to strengthen the information needs that we all together rely on.